She thought it was just another quiet afternoon on her street, until the moment everything changed with a single command that made the air feel heavier. The late afternoon sun in a calm suburban neighborhood in Virginia cast long shadows across neatly lined sidewalks and parked cars. Sarah Mitchell, a 32-year-old black woman, had just returned from a short bike ride to clear her mind after a long day of remote work. She lived in the same neighborhood for years, knew most of her neighbors by name, and often described the area as peaceful and predictable. Today felt no different at first. She leaned her bicycle against her driveway fence, adjusting her water bottle and taking a slow breath, unaware that she was being watched from across the street. A patrol car had slowed earlier than usual, lingering longer than necessary, its presence subtle but deliberate. Inside the vehicle sat Officer Daniel Reed, a white male officer in his late 30s, whose expression was unreadable as he observed her movements with an intensity that did not match the calm environment. Sarah noticed the car only briefly, assuming it was routine patrol, but something about the way it remained unsettled the rhythm of the street. As she stepped toward her front yard, the officer exited his vehicle and called out, his tone sharp enough to cut through the still air. He questioned her presence in a way that suggested suspicion rather than curiosity, asking for identification without clear cause. Sarah paused, confused but composed, trying to understand why a simple return from a bike ride had turned into an interrogation on her own street. Her posture remained calm, her responses measured, but the tension between them grew with each exchange. Across the street, hidden partially behind a delivery van, a second figure observed everything without intervening. Marcus Cole, a former Navy SEAL in his early 40s, stood quietly with his trained military K9 beside him, a disciplined German Shepherd named Ranger. They had been returning from a routine training walk when they noticed the patrol car slow down unusually. Marcus did not speak at first, his attention focused entirely on the interaction unfolding in front of Sarah's home. His posture was still, analytical, recognizing patterns of escalation before they fully formed. Ranger remained alert but controlled, sensing his handler's focus and mirroring his calm vigilance. The situation had not yet turned physical or chaotic, but the imbalance of authority and uncertainty was already visible in the body language of everyone involved. Sarah maintained her composure, standing her ground with quiet confidence, while the officer's questioning continued to grow more insistent. Marcus stepped slightly forward but remained at a distance, observing rather than interrupting, aware that timing and judgment mattered more than reaction. The neighborhood around them remained silent, unaware that this ordinary afternoon was slowly shifting into a moment that would soon draw unexpected attention and reveal that more than one set of eyes was watching every detail unfold. The morning air in the neighborhood of Willow Creek felt unusually still, the kind of silence that made every passing sound feel louder than it should have been. Angela Brooks adjusted the strap of her backpack as she rode her bike along the familiar street she had traveled for years, her expression calm but focused, her eye scanning the sidewalks out of habit more than concern. She had lived here long enough to know every corner store, every porch light, every cracked section of pavement, and yet something about the atmosphere today felt slightly off, like the neighborhood itself was holding its breath. Behind her, an unmarked police cruiser moved slowly along the curb lane, keeping distance but maintaining pace. Inside the vehicle, Officer Daniel Carter watched the street with a practiced seriousness, his attention narrowing as he observed the interactions unfolding ahead. He had been called to the area for a routine patrol assignment, but routine rarely stayed that way for long in his experience. Angela continued pedaling forward, unaware of the watchful presence behind her, her thoughts centered on the small errands she planned to complete before returning home. The sunlight filtered through the trees lining the street, casting shifting patterns across the pavement, and for a moment everything appeared normal, almost peaceful. However, the cruiser's presence began to stand out more clearly as it slowed further, positioning itself at a cautious distance. Officer Carter made a brief comment into his radio, his tone controlled and professional, acknowledging movement in the area that he intended to monitor more closely. Angela noticed the vehicle in her peripheral vision but did not react beyond a slight adjustment in her posture, continuing forward with steady motion. Her focus remained forward, but her awareness sharpened, the way it always did when she felt observed in a way that did not feel entirely routine. The neighborhood itself began to feel smaller, the distance between each landmark compressing under the weight of quiet attention. The cruiser's windows reflected fragments of houses and trees as it followed her path, never too close, never fully away. Inside the vehicle, Officer Carter's expression remained firm, but there was a subtle tension in his posture as he evaluated the situation unfolding in real time. He was trained to assess behavior, to interpret movement, to anticipate escalation before it occurred, and that training now guided his observation of the cyclist ahead. Angela maintained her pace, her grip steady on the handlebars, her breathing even, though her awareness of the vehicle behind her had become impossible to ignore. The street ahead curved slightly, revealing more of the neighborhood's quiet rhythm, children's bicycles resting on lawns and mailboxes lined in neat rows. Yet beneath that ordinary surface, the dynamic between observer and observed was beginning to shift in ways neither fully acknowledged out loud. The cruiser slowed again, matching distance, maintaining presence without closing in, and the space between them became the silent center of an unfolding tension that had not yet declared its purpose but was already shaping everything around it. The street looked ordinary at first glance, yet every detail carried a weight that felt unusually sharp, as if the air itself was holding its breath. Angela Brooks moved steadily along the sidewalk, keeping a calm pace that matched her controlled breathing, her eyes scanning without showing fear, only awareness shaped by experience she never openly talked about. She had learned long ago that presence mattered more than reaction, and silence could sometimes speak louder than confrontation. On the opposite side of the block, Officer Mark Reynolds stood near his patrol vehicle, his posture rigid in a way that suggested authority but also impatience, his attention fixed on Angela with a focus that felt disproportionate to the situation. There was no immediate incident, no emergency call unfolding in real time, only a growing tension built from interpretation, assumption, and tone. Hidden from plain view, Chief Petty Officer Daniel Hayes observed from a distance inside an unmarked vehicle, his expression steady and unreadable, while his trained military service dog, Rex, remained perfectly still, alert to subtle shifts in movement and sound that others would easily ignore. Hayes had not intervened, nor had he revealed his presence. He was there to assess, not to escalate, and every second he watched added layers of understanding rather than reaction. Angela paused near the edge of the sidewalk, briefly adjusting a strap on her bag, her gaze lifting toward the officer with a composed expression that refused to mirror tension. Officer Reynolds spoke from several feet away, his voice firm, carrying the tone of command that he believed the situation required, but his words remained within procedural boundaries rather than physical action. Angela responded calmly, her voice measured, asking simple clarifying questions that revealed more about her intent to understand than to challenge. The interaction unfolded like a quiet negotiation of perception rather than force, each sentence revealing how differently both sides interpreted the same environment. From his concealed position, Hayes noted every detail, from body language to timing, recognizing patterns that did not align with escalation but with misunderstanding. Rex shifted slightly, not in distress but in focus, tracking emotional intensity rather than physical threat. Angela remained grounded, her stance unchanged, her demeanor steady. In a way that subtly redirected the energy of the encounter without confrontation. Officer Reynolds hesitated briefly, as if recalibrating his approach, sensing that the expected dynamic was not unfolding as anticipated. The neighborhood around them continued its normal rhythm, distant footsteps, faint traffic, a dog barking far away, all contrasting with the focused stillness at the center of the scene. What made the moment significant was not action but awareness, the quiet realization that every participant was being observed in ways they did not fully recognize. Hayes adjusted his position slightly in the vehicle, still unseen, documenting mental notes rather than interventions, understanding that perception often shaped outcomes more than intent alone. Angela exhaled slowly, maintaining her composure, while Officer Reynolds lowered his intensity by a fraction, as if reconsidering his interpretation of the situation. The balance of the moment shifted not through force, but through presence, restraint, and the silent weight of being observed by someone trained to recognize the difference between escalation and control. The tension in the street did not increase suddenly, but it deepened in a way that was almost imperceptible, like a slow change in atmospheric pressure before a storm that never fully arrives. Angela Brooks remained exactly where she stood, her posture relaxed but intentional, her eyes moving in small controlled shifts that suggested she was evaluating distance, angles, and movement patterns without making it obvious to anyone watching. Officer Mark Reynolds adjusted his stance near the patrol vehicle, his hand resting briefly on his utility belt in a habitual gesture rather than an active threat, his attention still locked onto Angela as if trying to categorize her behavior within a framework that did not fully fit what he was observing. The conversation between them continued at a measured pace, neither escalating nor dissolving, existing in a space where interpretation mattered more than action. Angela spoke calmly, her tone steady and clear, asking questions that focused on clarification rather than confrontation, her words carefully structured to avoid misunderstanding while still asserting her awareness of her surroundings and her rights to be present in the space she occupied. Officer Reynolds responded with procedural language, maintaining authority in tone but gradually showing signs of uncertainty in timing and phrasing, as if recalibrating his assumptions in real time. From a concealed position down the block, Chief Petty Officer Daniel Hayes observed everything without revealing himself, his focus shifting between the officer, Angela, and the subtle environmental cues that most people would overlook entirely. His trained service dog, Rex, remained close, alert but controlled, tracking emotional fluctuations and micro-movements with disciplined focus, responding not to aggression but to intensity and intention. Hayes noted the change in Reynolds' posture, the slight reduction in rigid control, and the way Angela's calm consistency was beginning to influence the rhythm of the interaction. There was no sudden breakthrough, no dramatic shift, only the gradual rebalancing of perception as each participant adjusted to the presence and behavior of the others. Angela took a small step forward, not invading space but indicating confidence, her expression remaining composed, her voice steady as she continued to seek clarity in a situation that had begun with misunderstanding rather than intent. Officer Reynolds paused for a moment longer than before, his gaze shifting briefly away as if reassessing the narrative he had constructed in his mind. Hayes recognized this pause immediately as a critical turning point, not because of escalation, but because of reconsideration. Rex shifted his weight slightly, remaining attentive but calm, signaling stability rather than alert. The surrounding neighborhood continued its ordinary rhythm, vehicles passing in the distance, faint conversations echoing from nearby sidewalks, a world moving independently of the concentrated exchange taking place at the center of the block. Angela's composure remained unchanged, her presence steady and grounded, creating a contrast against the uncertainty that was beginning to surface in Officer Reynolds' responses. Hayes observed without intervening, understanding that the situation was resolving not through force or authority, but through observation, restraint, and the gradual correction of perception under quiet scrutiny. The moment continued without interruption, but the meaning of it was changing in real time, like a conversation slowly rewriting itself while it was still being spoken. Angela Brooks maintained her calm presence, her breathing steady, her gaze fixed on Officer Mark Reynolds with a level of patience that suggested she was more interested in resolution than dominance. She did not raise her voice, nor did she retreat, instead holding a balanced position that communicated awareness and restraint in equal measure. Officer Reynolds appeared to be processing new information, his earlier certainty gradually replaced by a more cautious evaluation of the situation in front of him. His posture, once firm and directive, now carried subtle signs of hesitation, not weakness, but recalibration as he attempted to align procedure with what he was actually observing rather than what he had initially assumed. He asked a few additional questions, this time slower, more deliberate, as if testing whether the responses he received would confirm or contradict his original interpretation. Angela responded consistently, her answers clear, measured, and focused on facts rather than emotion, reinforcing a pattern of communication that reduced ambiguity with each exchange. Down the block, Chief Petty Officer Daniel Hayes remained in position, his observation precise and controlled, noting how the interaction was shifting from confrontation toward assessment. He did not intervene because intervention was not required, and his training emphasized recognition of when a situation resolves through awareness rather than action. Rex, the military-trained dog at his side, remained alert but calm, tracking tone and movement without reacting to any perceived threat, reflecting the stability that was beginning to settle into the environment. Hayes observed Officer Reynolds adjust his stance again, this time less rigid, as though accepting that the situation required adjustment rather than enforcement. Angela took a slight step back, not as withdrawal, but as a gesture of space creation, allowing the conversation to continue without pressure. The surrounding neighborhood continued its ordinary flow, a reminder that the moment was isolated in perception rather than reality, significant only to those directly involved. There was no escalation, only a gradual softening of tension as understanding replaced assumption. Officer Reynolds finally paused, longer than before, and when he spoke again, his tone had shifted toward clarification rather than command. Angela listened without interruption, her expression steady, signaling that she was engaged in resolution rather than resistance. Hayes noted this transition as the critical point where uncertainty began to dissolve, replaced by a structured return to professional protocol grounded in accurate assessment rather than assumption. The exchange, once defined by tension, now moved toward closure through measured communication, controlled observation, and the quiet correction of misinterpretation. The atmosphere settled into a new kind of silence, not empty but structured, as if the space itself understood that the moment of uncertainty had passed and what remained was clarification. Angela Brooks stood in the same position, but her posture reflected a subtle easing, her shoulders no longer carrying the invisible weight of being misinterpreted, while her attention remained fully present on Officer Mark Reynolds. The officer, in turn, had shifted into a more reflective state, his earlier urgency replaced by careful processing, as though each detail he had gathered was being reorganized into a more accurate picture. His voice, when he spoke again, carried a noticeably different cadence, slower and more deliberate, indicating that he was no longer attempting to assert authority but instead seeking alignment with verified understanding. He acknowledged the information Angela had provided, and his responses now focused on confirmation and procedural clarity rather than assumption. A brief pause followed each exchange, giving space for thought rather than reaction, and that pause itself became part of the resolution process. Down the street, Chief Petty Officer Daniel Hayes maintained his observational stance, his focus steady, recognizing that the situation had entered its final phase of de-escalation. He noted the absence of tension markers that had been present earlier, such as rapid repositioning or heightened vocal projection, and instead observed a steady return to standard communication patterns. Rex remained composed beside him, attentive but calm, no longer tracking any perceived escalation, reflecting the environmental shift that had taken place. Angela adjusted her footing slightly, not as retreat, but as natural relaxation, signaling that she no longer perceived the interaction as a threat but as a procedural correction in progress. Officer Reynolds continued to engage, now asking for final clarifications in a manner consistent with completion of a field assessment, his tone respectful and measured. The exchange became increasingly procedural, focused on verification and resolution rather than conflict or correction. Hayes observed the final transitions carefully, noting how quickly professional clarity can replace initial misjudgment when communication remains steady and uninterrupted. The neighborhood around them remained unchanged, ordinary life continuing without disruption, reinforcing how isolated the misunderstanding had been within an otherwise normal environment. As the conversation reached its conclusion, Officer Reynolds gave a final acknowledgement that indicated acceptance of updated understanding, and his stance relaxed into standard neutral positioning. Angela offered a brief, calm response that reflected closure without emphasis, reinforcing mutual resolution. Hayes registered the moment as complete, not through any dramatic shift, but through the quiet return to equilibrium that followed accurate reassessment. The situation ended not with conflict resolved through force, but through communication refined by observation, patience, and correction of initial assumption. The moment of resolution did not arrive with any dramatic shift, but rather with a gradual settling of energy, as if the environment itself had decided the situation no longer required heightened attention. Angela Brooks remained in place for a brief moment longer, confirming internally that the exchange had reached a point of completion, her expression calm and steady, reflecting neither resistance nor hesitation. Officer Mark Reynolds stood a few feet away, maintaining professional composure while transitioning fully into closure mode, his body language now consistent with standard post-incident review rather than active response. His final statements were brief and structured, focused on confirming that all necessary information had been recorded accurately and that there were no outstanding safety concerns requiring escalation. Each sentence carried the tone of procedural completion, marking the end of uncertainty that had defined the earlier interaction. Chief Petty Officer Daniel Hayes continued observing from a distance, his attention now shifting from evaluation of behavior to confirmation of resolution stability, noting that all participants were operating within normal psychological and procedural ranges. Rex remained composed beside him, no longer tracking movement with heightened alertness, instead resting in a neutral stance that indicated full environmental normalization. Angela gave a final calm acknowledgement to Officer Reynolds, her tone even and controlled, reinforcing mutual understanding and closure. There was no urgency in her movements, only the natural rhythm of someone concluding an interaction that had required patience and clarity rather than confrontation. Officer Reynolds responded with a final professional nod, signaling acceptance and completion of his on-site responsibilities, and then began the subtle transition of preparing to depart, not abruptly, but in accordance with standard procedure. Hayes observed this transition carefully, recognizing the importance of how endings in professional environments are often defined not by declarations but by the absence of further questions or corrections. The neighborhood around them continued its ordinary flow, unaffected by the earlier tension, reinforcing the idea that most moments of misunderstanding exist briefly within larger systems of normal life. As Officer Reynolds stepped away, his posture remained composed, reflecting a return to routine duty awareness rather than incident focus. Angela remained still for a few seconds after his departure, then shifted slightly as if acknowledging internally that the situation had fully resolved. Hayes finally relaxed his observational focus, concluding his assessment as complete, noting that communication, when maintained with clarity and restraint, had guided the entire sequence toward resolution without escalation. The final state of the scene was quiet, balanced, and stable, with all individuals returning to their respective roles within an unchanged environment. The atmosphere after the resolution shifted into a quieter emotional register, where the weight of what had just occurred was no longer driven by urgency but by reflection. Angela Brooks stood near the edge of the sidewalk, her posture relaxed but thoughtful, as if mentally reviewing the sequence of events that had unfolded earlier. There was no sign of distress in her expression, only a composed awareness that the situation had transitioned fully into closure. She adjusted her bicycle slightly, ensuring it was steady, then took a slow step forward, re-entering the familiar rhythm of her neighborhood. Each movement she made reflected calm recovery, not from danger but from intensity of attention. Across the street, Chief Petty Officer Daniel Hayes observed the environment one final time, his analytical focus now softened into simple acknowledgement of completion. His stance remained grounded, but no longer evaluative, signaling that the moment had moved beyond observation into conclusion. Rex stood beside him in a neutral position, no longer scanning actively, simply present and calm, reflecting full environmental stabilization. Hayes gave a subtle nod, not directed at any individual, but rather an internal confirmation that the situation had ended without escalation or complication. Officer Mark Reynolds was no longer the focal point of attention, having already transitioned away from the immediate area in accordance with standard procedure, leaving behind only the trace of professional closure. The neighborhood itself resumed its natural cadence, pedestrians moving at an ordinary pace, distant conversations returning to normal volume, and the ambient sounds of daily life re-establishing dominance over memory of the earlier interaction. Angela took a final look down the street, her expression steady and composed, then continued walking alongside her bicycle with a sense of quiet forward motion, as though mentally placing the experience behind her. There was no dramatic aftermath, only the steady return of normalcy that followed the end of structured interaction. Hayes remained in place for a few additional seconds, ensuring that all environmental indicators confirmed stability, then relaxed fully into a neutral posture. Rex mirrored that calm state effortlessly, reinforcing the sense that the moment had fully resolved at every perceptible level. As Angela continued onward and gradually blended back into the flow of her surroundings, the final impression left by the moment was not one of conflict, but of completion, clarity, and restored equilibrium within an ordinary day. In the final stretch of the morning, the neighborhood had fully returned to its everyday rhythm, with sunlight settling evenly across the residential street and the earlier tension reduced to a distant memory in the flow of normal life. Angela Brooks continued forward at a steady walking pace beside her bicycle, her expression calm and reflective as she approached the familiar corner near her home. There was no urgency in her movement, only continuity, as if she had naturally re-entered the expected structure of her day after an interruption that no longer defined it. She paused briefly at the curb, looking both directions with quiet attentiveness, then stepped forward with measured confidence, continuing along the sidewalk. Her presence remained composed, and her focus was directed inward, suggesting that her thoughts were no longer on what had occurred but on the stability of what remained. A short distance away, Chief Petty Officer Daniel Hayes stood near the edge of the street, no longer engaged in observation, simply maintaining a neutral presence as the environment fully normalized. Around him, Rex remained calm at his side, exhibiting no signs of alertness, reinforcing the sense that the situation had reached complete resolution. Hayes shifted his weight slightly, glancing once more across the neighborhood as a final habitual check, then relaxed fully into a resting stance that indicated closure rather than vigilance. The surrounding community continued its natural activity without interruption, with a passing vehicle moving slowly down the road, a neighbor stepping onto a porch, and distant conversation carrying faintly through the air. Angela continued walking, gradually increasing the distance between herself and the earlier point of focus, her posture upright and steady, her movements unhurried and deliberate. As she moved further along the sidewalk, she briefly adjusted her grip on the bicycle handlebar, then resumed an even stride, seamlessly blending back into the normal cadence of her environment. Hayes offered no further intervention or observation, signaling through his stillness that no additional action was required. Rex remained composed, mirroring the calm atmosphere around them. The street, once marked by heightened attention, now reflected only the quiet continuity of a typical day in a residential American neighborhood, with sunlight, movement, and ordinary sound restoring complete balance to the scene as all participants naturally transitioned away from the moment and back into their respective routines.